Most religious beliefs are founded by doctrine that outlines and attempts to concretely preserve historic events that are significant to the formation of these beliefs. Without concrete evidence of a religion's past, it is difficult to create a devout following of motivated individuals to believe your particular beliefs are credible. Holy cities are often used by various religions to give this credibility to their respective religious histories. Although Buddhism is often considered a thought tradition rather than a religion, it still has a devout following of individuals and is subject to the same stipulations as formal religions. In other words, it is just as important to Buddhist followers to have a valid historic record of their beliefs as it is to followers of other religions. There are several cities that are considered holy to the Buddhist community. Some notable cities are Lumbini, Sarnath, and Srasti. Kapilavastu is another ancient Buddhist city that holds great significance to the history of the Buddhist following. Kapilavastu is where Siddhartha Gautama, or more commonly known as the Buddha, spent nearly his entire life up to the age of 29. Although there has been much debate over its exact location, the main events that took place there are the foundation for how the Buddhist thought tradition was created. The history of how the city came to be will first be examined, and then the significant events of Buddhism that took place there, and finally a look at the city today. To understand the context of the events that took place at Kapilavastu that pertain to Buddhism, it is helpful to look at the other history of Kapilavastu. That is, the history occurring before, after, and during the life of the Buddha that does not directly pertain to Buddhism. To simplify this, it is easier to start prior to the Buddha's arrival at Kapilavastu. In the 6th century BC, the Sakya warrior tribe was in the process of conquering land for their soon-to-be kingdom. The leader of the tribe was Suddhodana, who would become the eventual king of the Sakya tribe and empire. Kapilavastu was designated as the capital of the Sakya nation. Kapilavastu translated means the city of beautiful virtue. The city was located somewhere north of the Ganges River in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains. It more than likely was located somewhere on the border of Nepal and India. The capital was trademarked by a large palace that the king resided in with his wife, princes, and other upper caste individuals. There was also reported to be a large fortified wall around the city with a moat. The king was a very materialistic individual and lived a very lavish lifestyle that set him and his family apart from the rest of the community. This aspect of the palace environment would contribute to the Buddha's eventual departure from the city and the beginning of his path to enlightenment. Eventually, King Suddhodana began to give up his materialistic and warrior ways to pursue a life of virtue, a Buddhist lifestyle. This change would leave the kingdom in a fragile state, unable to defend itself. This would be the beginning of the fall of the Sakya Empire. Another tribe, the Kosala, was growing in strength and numbers around the same time that the king of the Sakya was converting to Buddhism. The Kosala were moving east across the Himalayan mountains, conquering land and developing an empire. The Kosala tribe, under the leadership of King Vidudaba, had taken control of much of the Sakya Empire and had the capital city surrounded. King Vidudaba ordered the warrior tribe to invade the city and destroy it to mark the end of the Sakya Empire. The city was torn between the new peaceful lifestyle adopted by King Suddhodana and their past warrior instincts that made the empire what it was prior. The Sakya warriors that stayed to fight were wiped out by the Kosala forces. The once great city of Kapilavastu was reduced to ruins and abandoned. The very few Sakya that survived the invasion and escaped fled to nearby villages to live in hiding, free from the Kosala. The contemporary city of Piprawa was one of the primary relocation sites and is believed by some historians to actually be Kapilavastu. This is because the Sakyas erected a stupa at this site with references to Kapilavastu engraved on it. A stupa is a memorial shrine or reliquary often created in honor of a deceased Buddha. The final accounts of ancient Kapilavastu are categorized by a series of land control changes and the writings of 2 Chinese travelers that visited the site. Eventually, the Kosala Empire fell to the Gupta conquest, which was taking control of the majority of India. Traveling after this Gupta takeover were 2 Chinese travelers. They each gave separate accounts of what was left of the city of Kapilavastu when they traveled through the city. Huang Xiang was the first of the 2 to travel to the former Sakya kingdom and to the former city of Kapilavastu. He found very little left to the area. He writes, "The capital is overthrown and in ruins. The foundation walls are still strong and high. It has been deserted. The peopled villages are few and waste." This account is concurrent with the previous descriptions of the city and its state after invasion. Fa Yan was another Chinese traveler that gave a similar account of what was left of Kapilavastu. He described the city as a great scene of empty desolation. In addition, he stated that it is very dangerous to travel to the city because of white elephants and lions that frequent the area. These two travelers' writings about the city of Kapilavastu are the main basis for clues archaeologists used in the following centuries to try and find out the original location of the city. Now that the events of Kapilavastu outside of Buddhism have been examined, the life of the Buddha and the events of Kapilavastu that are significant to Buddhism will be uncovered. The most important event in the history of Kapilavastu is the arrival of Siddhartha Gautama, the eventual Buddha. Queen Mahamaya became pregnant with the Buddha to be around 625 BCE. She left Kapilavastu to travel to her parental hometown to give birth. This was customary of the time. On the way to her hometown, the queen went into labor and was forced to give birth to Siddhartha in the town of Lumbini. 5 days later, the king brought 8 wise men to name the child and speak of the child's future. After watching the child for a while, the wise men came up with the name Siddhartha, meaning one whose purpose has been achieved. The wise men told the king that the baby will either become a universal monarch should he decide to rule, or if he renounces the world, he will become a supremely enlightened Buddha. On the 7th day after his birth, Siddhartha's mother died, and he was taken under the care of his mother's sister, Pahapati Gautami. He was taken to his father's palace in Kapilavastu, where he was to live as a prince. King Suddhodana was worried that his son would be influenced by the religious movements going on at the time, and was additionally worried by what the wise men had told him about his son's possible futures. He decided to keep his son behind the walls of the palace and to never let him see anything negative of the outside world. In other words, he was to stay in the lavish palace and to know no lifestyle different from his own. Siddhartha lived for 29 years behind the walls of the palace and enjoyed a very lush and easy life. He married a woman named Yasodhara around 608 BCE. He lived a very materialistic lifestyle of royalty and had everything given to him that he could ever need. One day, an elderly man made it to the palace despite the king's strict orders to screen everyone entering the area where Siddhartha resided. The king did not want anyone who was not in good health or youthful to be exposed to his son. Siddhartha eventually did see the man and was intrigued by the different side of life he was seeing. He ventured further into the town and he witnessed the sorrow of a beggar, sadness of an old man, pain of a sick man, and a dead body. Soon after, Yasodhara gave birth to Siddhartha's only child, a son named Rahula, around the time when the soon-to-be Buddha was 29. On the day of the birth, Siddhartha cut off his hair in an act of defiance and renounced his royal standing and lifestyle. He snuck out of the palace and traveled to the forest to seek enlightenment. He put on a hermit's robe and had all his possessions returned to his father. This is known as the Great Renunciation and marks the end of the Buddha's early years in Kapilavastu. Another important event that took place at Kapilavastu pertains to the creation of the Order of Nuns. The Buddha's foster mother remained in Kapilavastu after he left. She wanted to become ordained after watching Siddhartha and his son both renounce the worldly life for the higher life. However, women were not allowed to study with men because it would be too difficult for the men to eliminate all desire with women present. One day, the Buddha traveled to Kapilavastu from his residence at the Jetavana monastery. He was approached by his foster mother, who had cut her hair and put on a yellow robe. She asked him if she could create the Order of Nuns and allow women to seek sainthood. He denied her request on 3 separate occasions despite much persistence. The Buddha then returned to the Jetavana monastery. Soon after, Pahapati rallied a group of 500 maidens who all wore robes and cut off their hair in hopes of showing to the Buddha how devoted they were to their cause. They also hoped to persuade the Buddha to change his mind about the Order of Nuns. They marched 357 miles to the Jetavana monastery and refused any help along the way to further show their dedication. Upon arrival at the monastery, Pahapati confronted the Buddha's disciple Ananda and asked him to once again ask the Buddha to consider letting her form the Order of Nuns. The Buddha finally said that the women could attain sainthood just as men and consented to the establishment of the Order of Nuns. However, he established 8 conditions that had to be met for the order to be formed. Despite the stipulations that still did not make male and female students equal in standing, the maidens returned to Kapilavastu overjoyed by the news. So the creation of the Order of Nuns was rooted in the city of Kapilavastu and furthers the importance of the city to Buddhism as a whole. One of the fundamental ideas behind Buddhism is the idea of karma. Karma is the law that every action has an effect. It is important in explaining why certain things happen to certain individuals or groups. Past actions dictate future events. The power of this law is observed by an event that took place at Kapilavastu. The event took place when King Vidudaba of the Kosala, who was mentioned earlier, surrounded the city of Kapilavastu and was prepared to invade. The Sakya clan still had control of the city, and around 500 warriors still remained there. Buddha and his disciple Mogayana both had become arhats with supernatural powers. An arhat is someone who has fully realized for themselves the Buddhist doctrine and has freed themselves from the cycle of death and rebirth. They have reached a state of nirvana. Despite the powers one possesses by becoming an arhat, Buddha thought that no one can violate the law of karmic effect. The Buddha blocked the invasion of the Kosala 3 times with his powers before conceding that the karma of the materialistic Sakya warrior clan was to blame for the relentless invasion attempts by King Vidudaba. He